Thank you particularly to Jorge Sauma and to CORBANA for inviting me to give this talk, which I will now share with you. You see my presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing in Exeter on the potential impacts of climate change and extreme weather on banana production, focusing particularly on Latin America and the Caribbean. So the talk will be broken up into 6 sections, and the first section will be a very brief summary of climate change, what's happened and what might happen in the future. Then we'll turn to some previous work, previously published studies on potential climate change effects on banana production. And then to some new work, a new publication that we produced at Exeter, looking at the effects of climate change historically and in the future on global banana yields. We'll then take a look at a new distribution map of banana plantations which we've developed, which we hope will be a tool and a resource for research all over the world, but in particular will help us to think and model the future impact of climate change. We'll then think about the indirect effects of climate change on bananas via other factors such as plant diseases. And I know, some diseases are particularly worrying at the moment. And finally, we'll look at the impacts of extreme events like hurricanes on banana production and what that means. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at what's happened. Now, here are 2 very famous graphs, which I'm sure you need no introduction to. On the left, you can see the increasing carbon dioxide concentration of the Earth's atmosphere, which is now well above 400 parts per million. And on the right, you can see the global average temperature trend since 1860, and now we're well above 1 degree Celsius compared to historical averages. So the Earth is warming up. Now, what might happen in the future? Well, there's a great deal of uncertainty. It depends on how the international community responds, but we can expect that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere will continue to increase, and under most of the scenarios we're looking at CO2 concentrations increasing to probably above 800 parts per million by the end of the century. There is a possibility, of course, that we could control climate change and CO2 emissions. If we look on the right, we can see that different CO2 emission scenarios give us different levels of warming, but there's a possibility that we could be looking at 5 degrees global average temperature rise by the end of the century. But we very much hope that doesn't happen, and that we can hold the temperature rise to between 2 and 3 degrees C. If we zoom in on the region of Central America, which I think is of interest to many in the audience, then under a moderate emissions scenario, we can expect the region to warm by between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century compared to recent conditions. So warming is definitely going to happen. Now, in addition to thinking about average trends in things like temperature and also precipitation, which I haven't mentioned yet, we can also think about the impacts of extreme events such as extremely high temperatures, floods, storms, hurricanes, and that kind of thing. And historical data collected by the Munich reinsurance company, suggests that extreme events of a climatic origin have been increasing over the past few decades. There's still a lot of uncertainty as to what might happen in the future, but this trend does seem to be real and concerning. So we need to think about both trends in average temperatures and humidities, but also changes in extreme event frequency. So now let's turn our attention to banana production itself and how climate change might affect that. So let's look at the direct effects of climate change on bananas. So weather actually affects banana production in many ways, and we need to think about the different components of the weather system and how the banana production might be affected. So, of course, the obvious impact of temperature and moisture on growth of bananas is the one that's normally modelled. But we could also think about the role of the amount of sunlight. So if cloud cover changes, that would have an effect on the amount of photosynthetic activity that's going on. Changes in wind strength and wind speed can affect the canopy of bananas. High winds can cause shredding of leaves and reduce photosynthetic rates. And then, there are also the extreme events of droughts and floods, which we'll talk about later. So, in order to understand how bananas might respond, we need data and information on the physiology of bananas, but actually, compared to other crops like wheat and maize and rice, the physiology of the banana plant and the different cultivars is actually quite poorly understood, and very little in the scientific literature in comparison. So, for example, if we look at this recent review of environmental physiology of bananas, some of the data that's being cited in that review is very old, from the 1970s. So given that uncertainty and perhaps lack of detailed knowledge on how bananas respond to climate, we need to think of ways in which we can predict what might happen in the future. And there have been a number of attempts to do that. So I'll just take you through 3 or 4 examples of publications which have come out in the past decade or so. The first of them is this one, and if you look on the slides, if you're interested in any of these, I've listed the publication, so you can follow those up if you like. So this one was actually looking at climate change effects in the subtropics, and it used a model called the eco-crop model, and the eco-crop model allows you to set physiological parameters for plant growth. So the minimum temperature for growth, T-min, the optimum temperature, T-opt, and the maximum temperature, T-max, and then also for precipitation. In this case, the authors chose an optimum temperature for subtropical banana growth of between 17 and 26 degrees C. And they found that actually there's quite a variable impact of climate change on subtropical banana production, in this case, using that particular model. Another alternative approach is to use a species, what's known as a species distribution model, which essentially looks at the current distributions of a species, in this case, bananas. So it uses a map of banana production. And it matches that map of banana production to maps of temperature and rainfall and other climate variables. And then it tries to predict what might happen to the distribution of a species in the future. And this particular publication suggested that banana production could be lost from large areas of Central America and Colombia by the 2060s. So quite a worrying prediction. Another recent publication, this time focusing on Africa, sub-Saharan African agriculture, and again using the eco-crop model, suggested that among the tropical crops of cassava, yams, and bananas, the impact of climate change on those would be greatest for bananas. So the area of production that would have to undergo some sort of transformational change, so switching to another crop, was greatest for bananas of all those tropical crops. So again, quite a worrying prediction there. Then focusing in more detail on a particular country in Africa, Uganda, which has among the highest banana production in the world. The East African highland banana area, again using the eco-crop model, is expected to shrink by towards the end of the century. So in this case, you'll see that the model parameters are actually quite different in comparison to the subtropical model, where the optimum growth is expected to occur at between 25 and 35 degrees C. Okay, so a much warmer climate. Okay. So these approaches used best estimates, I suppose, of how well bananas grow under different temperatures, or they used best guesses at where bananas are currently grown. But we felt that there was scope for a new analysis which looked at global banana yield values in each year. So we decided to undertake a new analysis to really get a little bit more detail about what's happening around the world in terms of production and climate. So we collected as much subnational production and yield data as we could from 6 regions globally. So Latin America and the Caribbean, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, China, and Southeast Asia, including Australia. And we collected data going back as far as we could, sometimes to the 1960s, but often to the 1980s. And we matched that data to global maps of annual average temperatures and annual average rainfall precipitation. And then we fitted nonlinear models. So we fitted our best guess models to yields over time for those regions to develop new physiological response models for banana production in those different regions around the world. And you'll see there's a lot of noise, but I'll explain how we deal with that noise in a second. So this is just the fitted yields for the Latin American, Central American region. And that allowed us to build these response models which estimate yield from total annual precipitation and mean annual temperature. Okay, and we did that for each different region. And so for each region, we actually get quite a lot of apparent variability in the optimum mean annual temperature and the optimum total annual rainfall. And the black bars here just show you where those means lie. So, for example, for Africa, the optimum mean temperature is about 30 degrees C, whereas for Brazil and China, we found that the optimum temperature is actually much lower in our estimation. The total annual rainfall which is best for bananas, also seems to vary, but there's a lot of spread in this data. So and overall globally, we get a value of about 27 degrees C as the optimum mean annual temperature for banana production, and that fits with previously published estimates. So these values give us our raw material for generating a model of what has happened to production due to climate change and what might happen in future. So we can use the model to tell us, what has climate change done in the past and what might it do in the future to yields. And by applying those regional models, we actually found quite a lot of variability. So from 1961 to 2016, we actually found that most African production and most Latin American and Central American production has probably benefited from climate change over the past 50 years. The only counterexample being Colombia. Asia seems to have lost yield due to climate change. And other large producers like India and China have probably gained slightly. So if we look forward to 2050 using two different climate change projections, we get quite a variable picture. For Africa again, because of that high optimum temperature that we think we've detected for African banana production, actually African production will continue to benefit from climate change in the future. But the picture varies dramatically for the other countries and regions in our study. Colombia in particular seems to be at risk. India, the world's largest banana producer, seems to be at risk. And again, the Southeast Asian nations seem to be at risk. The one country that appears to benefit or may benefit in the future is Ecuador. And remember, these predictions are just considering climate change. So here's a map which indicates what might happen by 2050. And you can see that Colombia highlights in red here these different regions where bananas are produced, tend to have reduced production or reduced yields, whereas Ecuador tends to have a slight increase in yield. But as I mentioned, those models only look at the climate change effect. If we look at actual trends over time in yields for different countries, we get very different patterns. So some countries have very rapidly increasing yields, much more rapid than we would expect from climate change alone. So Ivory Coast, India, China, Costa Rican yields have gone up dramatically, whereas other countries like Colombia and Malaysia, the reported yields have declined recently. So that brings us to the idea that there is, there are other, what we might call technological factors which are affecting production in those countries. So those could be things like investment in irrigation systems, investment in tissue culture or new varieties. So if we look at the technological trends, once we take climate trends into account, we can divide countries up into regions that will benefit from climate change, so on the right-hand side of the graph, or have shown historical large increases in the technological component, so those at the top of the graph. So there are some countries, and for example, Côte d'Ivoire in Africa appears to be one, where both the climate change trend and the technological trend is positive. So those countries we could call safe. On the other side, there are countries, perhaps like Panama, where the observed climate change effect is negative and the technological trend is small or low or negative. And those countries we could say are in danger from future climate change and need to, those countries need to consider ways in which they can counter the effects of climate change in the future. And then there are countries where the climate change trend is predicted to be negative, but have actually shown very rapid growth in yields. So those are countries like, well, Costa Rica is there, India is there. So investment in banana production methods perhaps have boosted yields in those countries. Okay. So that was a model based on published yield data. So that's one approach that we can take. Another approach we can take is to look at where bananas are currently grown. Now, one of the studies I showed earlier used known or assumed production areas of bananas. But we actually lack a large-scale, accurate banana production map globally. If we look at imagery, imagery from, let's say, satellites or aerial photography, like the one you can see here, the banana plantations actually look quite different from the surrounding land use types. So they look very different to forest, they look different to other production types. So that made us think we could perhaps use remote sensing to generate a large-scale map of banana production. And that took us to the idea of using the new Sentinel-1 radar system, which is aboard the ESA Sentinel-1 satellite. So what this satellite does is, as it orbits the Earth, it scans the Earth's surface with a radar, with two radars actually, and provides very high resolution, 10-meter resolution imagery of the Earth's surface. And it has the benefit that radar can penetrate cloud cover. And so we get rapid updates of this imagery. And one of our researchers, Varun Varma, worked with Sentinel-1 radar imagery to develop an algorithm which could pick out banana production from other vegetation types. So we now have a map of banana plantations for the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean down to a resolution of around 50 meters. And that gives us very, very accurate estimates of where bananas grow and which regions have been selected for production. Now, that's not simply a matter of climate. Obviously, there are lots of other factors which determine where bananas will be produced. For example, we believe that distance to a port is very important. And the other thing we can't do is pick up banana plants which are grown in mixed cultivations with other species. We can only really pick up the plantations. But what it allows us to do is to compare the climate space of banana production with that of the other vegetation types in Latin America. So this graph here shows you it's an image which indicates the area under different temperatures and precipitations in Latin America. It's what we call the climate space. And you can see that although there are some regions with temperatures annual temperatures down to -10, so the high Andes, and up to let's say 6,000 or so millimeters of precipitation, most of the area is round about 27 degrees C with precipitations of around 2,000 millimeters. We can then pick out those areas which are under banana production, and that gives us a much reduced climate space. But it really does highlight that banana production is very tightly concentrated in climate space. So the yellow dot there, you can see that climate zone is the most popular for banana production in Latin America. And that leads us to believe that actually climate change could have quite a strong influence on where bananas are grown, given that the production areas are so tightly concentrated in climate space. Okay, so let's now move, so let's think about the indirect effects of climate change. So we've thought about how temperature and precipitation and changes in the average temperature and precipitation could affect where bananas are grown and how much they yield. Indirect effects of climate change hinge on the effect that climate has on organisms that are important to banana production, and in particular pests and diseases. So we conducted a study which looked at the effect of climate on black sigatoka or black leaf streak disease, Sigatoka negra. And this disease depends greatly on temperature and humidity. There's a lot of research done which shows that very high relative humidity leads to high spore germination, and that temperatures of around 27 to 28 degrees C are optimum for this disease. So we can use that information to think about how climate change has affected the spread of black sigatoka across Latin America since its arrival, I believe in 1972 in Honduras. So the model can be run across the entire region, irrespective of whether bananas are grown in those particular areas or not. And essentially what it shows us is that over large areas of Latin America, the risk of black sigatoka infection has increased over the past 60 years or so. Using an older distribution map of banana production, we can then pick out how disease risk has changed in different countries. And we find that for the banana producing areas of many countries in Latin America and Central America, the disease risk has increased over those decades. In fact, ironically, the only areas which have probably seen a slightly reduced risk are Honduras and Guatemala. And that brings us to the most concerning banana disease of them all, Fusarium wilt, tropical race 4. We've been working on some preliminary analyses of the rates of spore germination of this disease. And I'm just showing you some preliminary data which indicates that for the 3 spore types of this devastating disease, the optimum temperature is quite similar, and it's around 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. but the breadth of temperatures under which the disease will germinate is very wide. And so we can expect that climate change will actually probably benefit this disease, unfortunately. So that's preliminary results that need to be validated, but we hope to have further data soon. Okay, so we've now thought about direct effects of changing climate on the banana plants themselves and on some of the organisms which attack them. But we also need to think about extreme events. So here you can see the tropical storms and hurricanes of Katia, Irma, and Jose coming across the Atlantic in September 2017, a very rare and quite frightening occurrence. So we've been working with researchers in Switzerland at ETH Zurich and in the Dominican Republic to investigate the impact of those hurricanes in the Dominican Republic and their subsequent recovery. So the big impact really was the flooding which happened and caused a lot of damage to banana plantations. So this map shows you, using our satellite-based remote sensing, shows you all of the banana plantations in Monte Cristi, in Valverde and Santiago, provinces of Dominican Republic. And in red, it shows you the plantations which were damaged by those hurricanes, so around 20% or so. We were then able to use time series, so repeated satellite images, to look at the recovery rates of damaged banana plantations. And what we found was that recovery of those plantations takes about a year and a third, so around 450 days. And working with our colleagues in Zurich and with researchers in Dominican Republic, we were able to try and understand why that varies between different farms. And we found that training of farmers to deal with flooding and financial support to replant their plantations were two of the most important factors to help farms recover quickly. Okay, so in conclusion, banana physiology is a greatly under-researched topic. You know, we all know that there are many dozens, hundreds of different varieties and cultivars of bananas, but we know very little about how they behave under different weather conditions, or at least in a scientific sense. Climate change affects banana production through long-term change, so changing average temperatures and rainfalls, but also through those extreme events like those hurricanes, and indirectly through factors like disease. What we don't know is how climate change would affect other organisms, such as beneficial microbes like mycorrhizal fungi. Both through our investigation of global trends in yields over time and by our research in the Dominican Republic, it's clear that investment in technologies and risk management can really help to reduce any negative climate change impacts. So here are the publications which I described, some of the work that we've done recently. And I would just like to thank CORBANA again for inviting me to speak today, and also my colleagues Varun Varma and Jonathan Mosedale, who helped with the remote sensing and distribution analysis, Will Kay, Sarah Go, and Rachel Piper, who've been working on the TR4 spore germination rates, Jose Antonio Guzman from CORBANA, who's also worked closely with Varun Varma on our work, and our sponsors, BBSRC, the European Union, and the Science and Technology Facilitation Committee. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.